Hello, everyone. My name is Carol Cohn. I'm the director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here at UMass Boston, as well as everyone who is joining us on Zoom today. Now, I just want to take 2 minutes to tell you something about the series within which this talk sits. The theme is climate breakdown and the war system. Right now, there's a tremendous gap in the North American political and academic discussions of the root causes of the climate crisis and the ways we might possibly address them. With a few notable exceptions, there is silence about the role of wars and of the wider war system that makes them possible. To the extent that they appear in climate discussions, it is often within an increasingly common framing of the climate crisis as a national security threat or a threat multiplier that will create greater worldwide instability and conflict. And then militaries are posed as the obvious solution to dealing with this crisis. What is nearly completely missing here is that the relationship goes in the opposite direction. Militaries and the wars they fight have a massive role in creating and exacerbating the climate crisis and other forms of ecological destruction. Militaries, and especially the US military, produce vast amounts of greenhouse gases. Even when we are at peace, they consume enormous quantities of fossil fuels and other mineral resources in their everyday operations, including basing, training, transport, and construction, and in their reliance on and support of a massive network of arms and weapons manufacturers. And their role in driving ecological collapse intensifies when you then consider the wars themselves and the vast carbon emissions generated not only by fighting war, but also by all of the building, reconstruction, and manufacturing needed as part of reconstructing after a war. In this year's speaker series, we are exploring multiple facets of this relationship between the war system and ecological destruction, including the direct impacts of military greenhouse gas emissions, the intensified extraction caused by the war system's demands for fossil fuels and minerals, the US's long history of using indigenous territories and spaces inhabited by other racialized groups as environmental sacrifice zones, and the militarized violence used against land defenders and climate refugees. Today, the second speaker in this series, we are thrilled to have our distinguished guest, Dr. Diana Ojeda. She's a professor in the Department of Geography and the Department of International Studies at Indiana University Bloomington, where she is also the director of the Commons Program at the Ostrom Workshop and the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And then we'll ask you what you do in your spare time. She holds 2 bachelor's degrees, one in history and one in economics, from Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, and a master and PhD in geography from Clark University here in Worcester. She's a feminist scholar who brings together perspectives from political ecology, critical agrarian studies, and political geography. Much of her research has centered on the Colombian Caribbean, where she analyzes the dynamics of land dispossession, agrarian extractivism, securitization, and state formation, with a particular interest in the processes of environmental and territorial defense, as you will hear today. She's published widely in both English and Spanish language academic journals and also does work to help bridge the gap between academia and policy. She recently participated as lead author of the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services put out by IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And then you know why everybody just uses the acronym. This is an intergovernmental organization committed to strengthening the role of science in public decision-making on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Speaking personally for a moment, I've learned a tremendous amount from her work on the gendered workings of agrarian extractivism in Colombia, on the conceptualization of land as property, and on feminist ecologies. So I'm especially excited and honored to have this opportunity to bring her to share her thinking with the consortium audience, both here and online. So with no further ado, please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming. I know some of you had to come, but it's okay. Thanks for being here. I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm very thankful for this opportunity to share my work I've been admiring the work of the Consortium for a long time, learning from Carol, and it's been fantastic. This presentation, thank you, addresses the question of what comes after the end of the world. And I address it critically with a lot of Latin American feminists, including, for example, Raquel Gutiérrez Aguilar. I believe that we're not here to manage hell, but to build something new. And that requires us to look at the horrors and at the same time look at what people do to undo them. So I hope to question the catastrophic narrative of the end of the world. First, because the world has ended so many times for so many people before. Also, because the answer, as Carol explained in her introduction, is militarization and violence. That has been the answer to the narrative of the end of the world. So I want to share with you something else besides the catastrophic narrative. I think from the Caribbean, where I'm from the Colombian Caribbean. This presentation is based on ethnographic research that I have carried out in the region, paying attention to militarization, land dispossession, environmental devastation, accumulation. And I want to think with the Caribbean because it is a fundamental place to understand our current times. If you think about the plantation system, the global economy that Sylvia Wynter, Michelle Rolfe Trouillot, among other Caribbean thinkers have been analyzing, if you want to understand precarization, if you want to understand crisis, if you want to understand environmental destruction, it seems like the Caribbean is definitely the place to be paying attention to. More recently, the work of Pauli Goffs, for example, she has a book that is called The Caribbean as Dark Laboratory. It's a provocation to think of the Caribbean as a place that condenses both the Edenic dreams of the West, but also the racist, capitalist, patriarchal enterprise of massive exploitation, extraction, and environmental degradation. I'm thinking here too with Malcolm Ferdinand. He has a book that is called Decolonial Ecology, where he analyzes the double fracture. So how environmental destruction and colonialism are inseparable. And you need to look at the Caribbean if you want to understand them. The Colombian Caribbean in particular is a place where banana plantations, military bases, and cruise ships alike have been making a history that is fraught with violence. Probably this is the image that you've had in your more recently, if you're thinking about the Caribbean. This shows a strike to a boat in international waters. The US justified it as part of the war on drugs. So this is a very clear example of US imperialism, which then adds another layer to, the British, French, and Spanish imperialisms in the Caribbean, and others, of course, conquests and invasions. But with feminist theorizations of militarization and securitization, I want to understand these processes as they are shaped in and through the everyday. So there's this evident, direct violence, but there's also an intimate socio-spatial reconfiguration that I want to understand that is based on control, vigilance, the constant mobilization of fear, and how militarization shapes, for example, technologies for disciplining labor, the way in which we understand education, health, housing. In my own work, I have studied how Colombia's securitization occurs through many forms of gender-based violence, but also how the supposed project of pacification, allegedly bringing peace of Plan Colombia, which was based by the US, was attained through the seemingly banal and everyday spaces of travel, leisure, and recreation. So I'll be going back to some of my earlier work on tourism. The narrative behind here is of narco-terrorists. US attacks have left dozens killed, injured, and detained without formal charges in the last few months, 2 months. And this is part of the forever war on drugs and how it really shows us how the Cold War morphed into the war against terror, the war against cartels, which is really, different forms of state violence that have to do with US imperial formations in the region. If you think about Puerto Rico, Vieques, this is super clear. Very quick moment of fact-checking. The narrative of narco-terrorists has very little information behind. Most drugs don't come from the Caribbean, they come from the Pacific. The most drug-related deaths because of overdose are related to fentanyl. We don't produce fentanyl in Colombia. Most fentanyl comes from Mexico, on the Mexico-US border, and smugglers are largely US citizens. Also, they are declining, and well, we can think about more things, how this is problematic. I thought we needed to do a quick fact check. You know, these days, fact checking seems very important. Al Jazeera has been reporting it as well in terms of US military intervention, and it is very easy to connect the longer history of US and Latin American and Caribbean relations with these imperial formations. It reminded me of the work by Eduardo Galeano and the idea that Latin America has the open veins, you know, like there's the wound that is still bleeding all the time, and you cannot think about the realities that I will share with you without these bigger forms of militarization and imperialism. I will be talking today about the Ciénaga of Juan Polo and La Virgen. The Ciénaga is located in the north of Cartagena. There you have a map. And bringing the Ciénaga back is how Black organizers refer to their efforts to defend wetland ecosystems in Cartagena, Colombia. Recovering the mangroves in the sense of reclaiming, healing, mending mangrove forests has become fundamental for many Black women organizations and Black queer organizations, as I will show you. I will talk about the Ciénaga because the translation to wetland doesn't really work. Wetland is Ramsar, you know, sustainable development language, blue economy language. I tried with marshes and swamps, but also that has that long history of negative connotations and interventions that have targeted these spaces as repositories of crime and disease. And this is part of what is happening, part of the story I will tell you. So I will just go with ciénagas. And I want to mention that mangroves are these amphibious ecosystems shaped by a long history of colonialism and racism, but also a long history of Black resistance and struggles for liberation that I will show you. This is Cartagena. Maybe you've been there. It is an important tourist city, but it's also a city where industrial waste, anti-Blackness, and tourism development have been adding to ongoing land dispossession and have deepened the precarization and suffering of most of its inhabitants. The Ciénaga of Juan Polo and La Virgen, this is the kind of ecosystem the mangroves are right there. The Ciénaga of Juan Polo and La Virgen, located in the north of the city, is surrounded by mangroves, resulting from the historical espacialization of maroonage processes and the struggle for land of many Black communities historically. And Cartagena is very interesting because it has been produced as a desirable tourist destination and a place fraught with catastrophe, almost like a precious, desired city that is left to die. So I wanted to have the two maps. On the left, you have the tourist map with the different tourist sites, and on the right, you have the map of projected scenarios of all of the places that are at risk because of climate change. And it reminded me New Orleans, because it is also, you know, a city that is highly desired within the US and US imaginaries for, you know, these touristic purposes, but also left to die. It also reminded me of Katrina, as militarization was the way to address climate change. And Katrina was a very good example. I always teach with Katrina because it really shows that there are no natural disasters, that all of these have been made. Cartagena is thus an example of what Francia Márquez Mina, an important environmental leader and anti-racist voice in Colombia, who also happens to be vice president. We can talk about that in the comments because it's a long story. But she refers to this as the imposition of a politics of death, referring to the multiple orders of death-producing violence that have been deployed over territories and bodies by the conjoint workings of colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Márquez explains that a politics of death results from these converging orders and materializes in place. It is the opposite of the possibility of living with dignity and without fear. And here life is not understood as an individual enterprise. This is more like a collective life where social reproduction is guaranteed for all, and vivir sabroso, which I will translate as living deliciously, we can discuss that as well, is available. It is important to mention that since its foundation in the 16th century, Cartagena was the main port to export South American gold extracted by the Spanish crown to the metropole. And along with Veracruz in Mexico and Portobelo in Panama, Cartagena was a major port of entry and commercialization of African enslaved people. For 3 centuries, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, there is an estimated trafficking of over 1 million enslaved persons who were disembarked, registered, sold, subjected to work in haciendas as part of the plantation system, which was mainly sugarcane at the moment, or in activities such as cattle ranching, gold mines, and port operations. Along with the decimation, displacement, and force of labor indigenous people in the region, the imposition of the colonial world order had at the core a vast enterprise of land expropriation and enclosure that still shapes the city today. The city, as I said, is a major tourist hotspot. It receives over 3 million visitors a year. But it is also a place where the construction of hotels and residential complexes largely transformed local ecosystems. So in order to build hotels, restaurants, and discotheques, there was a great destruction of mangroves and coral reefs that have been decimated since. So in the mid-20th century, it started this production of a city catered to tourists and available to most locals via the precarious working conditions as cooks, cleaners, taxi drivers, food vendors, sex workers, or hustlers. There's also this very sharp criminalization of Black communities living in the periphery of the city. So what you're seeing, those walls were built to protect the city from pirates in the 16th century. Now they hold the historic center, which is a place aimed to, cater for high-end tourists, leaving many Black communities outside in the peripheries of the cities, and they have been made disproportionately vulnerable to environmental destruction, health affectations, and climate change-related events, like the one you see here. It is the picture of a flooding. It happens every year. We know already the neighborhoods that are going to be flooded. And paired with that is this policing, militarization, and paramilitarism that are part of the fabric of the city. So there has come, an increased precarization partner with increased policing of the tourist city. This city has largely contributed to issues of water scarcity, waste disposal, and the disruption of the connectivity between the wetland and the sea. So you're seeing an image of a flooding, and floodings are not unexpected. Again, there are no natural disasters. This has been fabricated, and their consequences are distributed along racial, class, and gender lines. Also, Cartagena's history has been traversed by armed conflict, particularly after the onset of paramilitary forces in the late 1990s. A lot of Black communities and indigenous communities were displaced, leaving mostly women and children largely affected. And white mestizo elites have been able to retain power and control of land and capital throughout all of these centuries. So it is not uncommon to see the same last names, if you think about who was granted property on behalf of the Spanish crown and who owns today hotels, restaurants, and other businesses. So mangroves, as I mentioned, they have been decimated. This is part of the image that you're seeing here. And how, for me, it is very important to mention that the mangroves have been important spaces for Black liberation and maroonage. So the disappearance of the mangroves has larger implications for these communities. Very quickly, mangroves are contested spaces. They thrive in saline water. They are really fantastic in the sense that they make land out of water. There are aerial roots they hold the ground and they protect large areas from flooding, from hurricanes, from erosion, and the roots become the spanning grounds for fish and many other animals. So these are fundamental ecosystems. And of course, they have also become a frontier of capitalist accumulation. If you have been following the discussion on the blue economy and blue bonds, there's this new frontier of green enterprises. So mangroves tell us a story of displacement, of ongoing land theft, of ongoing racist violence in the city, at the same time that mangrove ecosystems are Black fugitive spaces, ecologies of Black resistance and liberation. And that tension, I'm going to keep going to that tension. Particularly important, I think it is to mention that some racist stereotypes have been perpetuated around these regions and around mangroves, and they portray Black people as out of place, as invaders or encroachers. So there has been a lot of criminalization and police terror aimed at Black communities living in the mangrove, to the point that the police has now a specific task force that is called the Eco Bloque, so the Eco Block, for guarding the mangroves from the invaders, which is very problematic because these are ancestral fishing grounds of Black communities, and those who flee the violence from state paramilitary and guerrilla forces in the 90s and 2000s ended up living near the mangroves, filling up the ciénaga of Juan Polo and La Virgen in the north of the city with the debris and garbage that is constantly thrown to them. So some of them started to gain some ground, making land out of water, similarly as the mangroves, and that's how they have been being attacked. I had the opportunity to meet members of local organizations of fishers, ethnotourists and ecotourist guides, Black women who are mangrove planters, and Black community organizations who identify themselves as peripheric Black and queer. They have been using all sorts of strategies, from cleanups and a lot of environmental education to voguing, theater, graffiti, tattoo, art installations in this defense of mangroves. So I will share with you 4 examples of these. The first opportunity that I had to meet them was with some ethno-ecotourist guides. I interviewed Don Ricardo in 2022. The Ciénaga is the lungs of the city, and yet they want to privatize it for the yachts. It is well known that they are building a complex for the rich. Each house will have a parking lot in the Ciénaga for their boats. Who are the invaders now? This is also very difficult work, as you can imagine. And as I mentioned, Cartagena is also an industrial hub. So the waters are really contaminated, and they still, have these tours as a way of bringing up these issues and doing a lot of environmental education in a city that doesn't really want to understand this. This is a render of how these houses and yachts will be in the Ciénaga. This is what he's referring to. This is one hotel in that area. If you've been to Cartagena, this is north of the city in La Boquilla. And this is Hotel Las Americas and other hotels who clearly have been built there, cutting mangroves and devastating these ecosystems, but they are not punished for that. It is the Black communities who live there, the ones that are receiving all this criminalization. For us, boquilleros, and this is Don Santiago, so people from La Boquilla, it's very hard. We're fishers, we've always been here. But Cartagena is only for the rich. They keep pushing us out. People end up selling whatever piece of land they got from their grandparents, and then they come back empty-handed, regretting having sold. The city offers nothing. All those buildings were mangroves not too long ago, but do you see? They can fill up the Ciénaga, no problem. When we do it to have a piece of land to live in, we are encroachers. We take care of the Ciénaga. It's hard work. You have to clean up every single day and then plant the seedlings. By planting mangroves, we have also seen the fish come back, fish and conch and crab. So it's kind of a very difficult work, and tourism for them is also like a side job. It's not a main source of income, but they do it as a way of reclaiming these ecosystems and bringing life to a city that, as Francia Marca puts it, is represents a good example of the imposition of a politics of death. The second example I want to share with you is Colectivo Comunitario Contexto. They have been doing a lot of mobilizations and denouncing the forced disappearances of young Black people by the police. So they are always paying attention to police terror, this practice that is very common in Cartagena that is called, quote unquote, social cleansing, which is a horrible way of attacking sex workers, drug users, and it is targeted mostly to Black people when they come in contact with tourists or the historic center. So they have been denouncing that using these art. Ali Mahul and Levi Chaverra, who are incredible scholars, artists, have been mobilizing, and they are community organizers from whom I've been learning so much. And they have been using voguing as one of the techniques, a lot of theater, also coming from a long tradition of the theory of theater of the oppressed in Latin America. And they have been using a lot of Afrofuturism to work with children in imagining a different city, another possibility. The third example I want to share is Casa Mangle, which is an organization that is also recovering the mangroves from this perspective of Black, feminist, queer organizing. Our idea was to fight climate change and racism, also providing support for women and their children. We are dissidents of normative gender and sexuality, Afro-Caribbean and Afro-feminist. The collective was born from the need to see the mangrove in a different way. The official policy has been to cut the mangrove down, seen as the layer of the one who smokes, for the one who steals, of the one who smuggles, of the one who kills. Our neighborhood is a place where you can shoot and kill. Our effort is to show another face. And these are the examples of the kind of activities. Oh, I know my mic was, hopefully you've been listening, my mic was a little bit off. But they've been doing a lot of recorridos of different tours in the city. This is other example of the kinds of ways in which they are raising awareness on mangrove destruction in Cartagena. And the last example I want to share with you is Villa Gloria. Villa Gloria is a neighborhood located in the north. They are roughly 26 families who live in very precarious conditions. They settled down there after forced displacement. Some families arrived in 1992, and they have been fighting to get titles to the land. The titles have been impossible to get, although they are recognized as a Consejo Comunitario, which is community council, a special legal figure that we have for collective property in Colombia, but they have not been able to find titles, in part because they are fighting the land with the Jaime family, which is one of these families who have retained power since colonial times. They are very vulnerable to climate change events, to flooding. These are images from November 2022. And they have to negotiate spaces and everyday life with this big hotel, Serena del Mar, which is called the Dream City. I took these images from their webpage and this idea of the Dream City. Again, we see, hotels that are allowed to be in the mangrove, no problem, criminalizing the community right by them. There are two murals where they were, now they're painted white. But at the moment, there were two murals that I think are important to bring and share with you, because it shows why their existence in that specific place is meaningful to them. It says, "We will always preserve our history, that of the Black Afro-descendant peoples. Let's protect what's ours." And the second mural is, "We, the women of Villa Gloria, demand respect." I asked them about all of these murals, and first they referred to the very important lands that they're occupying as recuperated lands, and they use recuperated in this sense of we are recovering what is ours, but also we are mending it, we're healing it. And also this has to do with some events of femicide and gender-based violence in this area. They received in 2006 some compensation for the construction of this mega infrastructure. This is a viaduct that connects Cartagena and Barranquilla. They were not consulted, and they should have been consulted by our law, our legal framework. So they were compensated with some seedlings. Of course, the money ran out very quickly, and they were only given the polymesh and some seedlings. But some women, 6, Doña Gloria included here, decided to keep planting the mangrove as part of their garden. So it was an extension of growing herbs and some food in their patios, in their little backyards. And they started planting the mangrove back to the Ciénaga, to the point that they have recovered 10 hectares of the Ciénaga and have been reforesting the area. These are some of the words of Doña Gloria Sanchez that you saw in the image. 4 times we've tried registering as collective territory, and they turn it down because Villa Gloria is at high risk. So this is below level, below grade, as I explained, they always get flooded. But these are recuperated lands. We had to deal with police and lots of repression. You see me and you can't tell that we've resisted 20 attempts of eviction, General Attorney Office, police, dogs. They have even sent paracos, paramilitaries. But what they don't see is that these are recovered lands. So again, sharing with you a little bit of the idea behind this. These efforts attest the powerful ways in which ecologies of resistance, shaped by Black geographies of liberation, continuously recreate livable presents and viable futures in Cartagena. Cartagena and the Caribbean as a whole brings us up close to the question of what is left after the end of the world. What comes after land is taken? Communities have been forcibly displaced by war. The militarization project is expanded. Ecosystems have been destroyed by industrial waste contamination and tourist expansion, the construction of mega infrastructures, the constant deployment of racist and state violence, and the permanent state of crisis inflicted by climate change. So this question, again, of what comes after all of that, what comes after the imposition of the politics of death that Francia Marquez refers to, and it is an effort of centering life. It is a politics of life that needs to be rehearsed daily. When I think about this example, I also think a lot with the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore when she says, she refers to prefigurative politics as a way of rehearsing the life that we want to see, rehearsing the world that we want to see. So rather than just a story of ongoing dispossession and rupture of traditional relations with the land, efforts to bring back the Ciénaga by Black communities, and particularly women and queer and trans people, tell a story of recuperating land. In Doña Gloria's words, it's beautiful to grow the mangrove, to see it flourish and resist over 60 years of discharges, industrial and sewage waste, dumped into the Ciénaga. The rest is history. Mangroves center the life-producing activities of Black communities, which have taken up the work to regrow and defend mangrove ecosystems. Everyday violence is continuously challenged and counteracted, and a politics of life, is rehearsed daily. I'm thinking here with Black ecologies and many different scholars who have been writing about this, Alex Moulton among them, Tiana Bruno, also inspired and reworking with the work of, for example, Sylvia Winter that I already mentioned, but also Beatriz Nascimento, thinking about Quilombola societies in Brazil, which challenge catastrophic narratives and seeing Black ecologies as spaces of death, contamination, already damaged spaces and already damaged people. They counteract these catastrophic narratives. And I argue that mangroves also help us counteract the logics of extraction, militarization, accumulation, and violence to instead center life. So some of the points that I've mentioned that I wanted to bring back, again, I'm thinking with Francia Marquez Mina, and how can we think about a politics of life and centering life amidst this imposition of a politics of death. One of the very important points that I want to convey is these articulations of anti-racist organizing and environmental defense and restoration, how this idea of defending Black territory is also a struggle for land, at the same time that it is counteracting gendered and racialized forms of violence and dispossession. As I mentioned, we can think of mangroves as Black fugitive spaces and ecologies of resistance and liberation that again show us that a politics of life is made possible, not just thinking about viable futures, but a livable present that is already here. Thank you so much. We have plenty of time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have about 30 minutes left for discussion, so I now want to invite questions from people in the room and on Zoom. So on Zoom, please submit questions through the Q&A function. And if you're in the room, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a mic. And before you ask your question, either in person or on Zoom, please briefly introduce yourself.
Hola, muchas gracias. I am Laura Castro Diaz. I'm an assistant professor here at UMass Boston at the School for the Environment. Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation. I know that everyone is so inspired, or at least I am. I think that for like here, there are like a lot of my students from a class that we are learning about the Sustainable Development Goals and aspects of gender inequality that we have been seeing in this class. Yeah, you know. But also during all of the classes and sessions, we discuss about like working with people to solve the issues that they have. And I think that your example is like perfectly showing how it's because of what they want and what they are doing, is trying like they are living the lives that they want. But how you, a person who is not an Afro-Colombian, arrives and start working with them. Could you tell us a little bit of that story, how you started working with them?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. And it is fantastic to hear that you're thinking about community partnered work and that you already have been discussing this. Hopefully you've seen the connections with gender inequality and environmental degradation. The methods question is a very important one, and it is also a very feminist one, because of course we care about the end, but it's more important the how. The hows are always a fundamental question, and for me too. So mangroves were always part of my life. My grandmother is a Black Afro-Colombian woman who wouldn't understand herself as that now. She's 95 and a long history to get there. But she was displaced from Cartagena. Her mom was a cook back in the mid-20th century. And she always put me to bed with songs of the grieving the mangrove and you know, the great loss of what it means to move out of Cartagena. That was always her heartbreak, was always part of me growing up. And also the physical mangroves, you know, when she introduced me to the sea, because the sea needed to know me. And you know, like mangroves were part of those ecosystems of grief that you see that now are more common. This is a conversation that is more common when we think also about snow-topped mountains in Colombia, the nevados. Like there's a lot of ecosystems that we're mourning now, that we're grieving now. So mangroves always. And then working with them came because of an opportunity teaching in Universidad de Cartagena. I used to teach during the summers in Universidad de Cartagena for 3-4 years. And there I met tons of students from the city and organizers from the Colombian Caribbean. And we were doing a lot of memory workshops, political memory workshops. So we did comic books. I love comic books. I've done graphic novels. That has been part of my work as well. So in class, we did a lot of comics and fanzines about this idea of memory loss and of ecological loss and memory. Like what is it what is your story? Where do you come from? Where do you think from? And we did tons of those workshops, and mangroves came up again and again and again. I was able to have some students, very close friends with Lady and Ali. So we started working together, and they took me to, you know, they shared with them their city. And that's how I started connecting the dots of their work, both intellectual and political, which is absolutely admirable. It's fantastic, the things that they do in Cartagena, which is a very difficult city. You can't be in Cartagena for a long time. I think it breaks your heart. And it is crazy because, yeah, the place that my abuela longed so much is also such a violent place. But that's how I started working with them, connecting with other organizations, and it really merged my teaching and my research in that way. But yes, hopefully also, you know, I have conveyed, you know, to the importance of Black thinking, of Black thinkers, of Black authors, of this very long tradition of Black ecological thought that is very, very important, in a way that, of course, has not been my lived experience at all. And Colombia, as well as Latin America, has to come to terms with its anti-Blackness, super profound. Like we grow up with this idea of the ideología del mestizaje, so this idea that we're all mixed, we don't see color because we're all just Spanish and indigenous and Black, which is of course a big lie, and it is very problematic. And I think we're only starting to come to terms in terms of that. One example is that the elites in, and I know I'm taking too long to respond, but a quick example of that, the elites in Cartagena refuse to be called Caribbean. And they are like, no, we are costeños, but don't relate us with the Black people in the Caribbean. We're not Caribbean. And if you see the map, it is the Caribbean. And the history, of course, speaks of that. So that is something that I think we always have to be careful with, especially if you are coming from these kind of narratives in Mexico, in Peru, in Colombia. It's always, always there. Thank you, Laura, for that question. Very important. Yes, we have one there and one here. Any order is okay. Thank you so much, Anna and Kathy, for doing that.
Where's the other one? Oh, yeah.
And I'll be shorter. That was a very big question.
So thank you for your presentation. I love learning about stuff like this because I view Blackness as a diaspora. Like I think in the U.S. especially, we only view Blackness in terms of African American, and to me, Black is a diaspora. So for me, learning about this is amazing. So thank you. My question is, you talked about how like they refuse to associate with anything of the Caribbean, and I'm gonna assume anything Black. So what hindrance does that play when you're trying to help and they don't associate with Blackness to begin with, or some people don't? So I mean, I know, honestly, I can tell you from personal experience because I'm from Cape Verde, and there's a lot of similarity in the Cape Verdean culture when it comes to identifying with anything African. So that's something that, you know, I can relate to because I've had to deal with it within my own family. So what I'm wondering is, what type of hindrance does that cause when you're trying to help people and make them understand?
Thank you so much for your question and for sharing that experience. And I definitely agree. And that has been one challenge in scholarship in the region. How do we have those hemispheric dialogues? Because racial formations are very specific to the place, but racism is of course universal. But how do we have those conversations? Cartagena is not the US South, but then how we connect the dots of the US plantation system, how it is connected to the plantation system in the Caribbean, and to think about Blackness. We have to be careful. Some of the hegemonic narratives of Blackness in the US, for example, are the blood count, these percentages of blood, that don't really work in places like República Dominicana, Brazil, and Colombia, where it is this idea of a thumb in the kitchen. So if you are a cook, if you are supposed to be smelling like oil, then that is a marker of Blackness. So again, just to say that the formations are so specific to the places that this case that I'm showing is on the Colombian Caribbean, which is completely different from the Pacific Caribbean, not in terms of, racism in both places, but in the Pacific, people were able to recognize as Black and Afro-descendant because of multicultural policies, which were tricky. They were a double-edged sword because Black people were associated to the rivers and to the jungle, and that's how they were able to gain some of the territorial rights and some of the land claims. But it was a double-edged sword, as you can tell, because what happens when you're not living by the river, but you're in the city? And the Caribbean, that is the case. The largest groups of Black and Afro-descendant communities in the Caribbean live in cities like Barranquilla, like Cartagena. So they were not, and still are not, as recognized as being Black and Afro-descendant in Colombia. So it is something that I think continues to be an important question, and also how people, yes, they don't want to recognize as Black, of course.
They're not recognized as Afro. I'm sorry. Hold on. So if they're not recognized as Afro descendant, then what is their category that they're recognized as? Like, are they just put under mestizos?
Some of them mestizos, and they would refuse to be called Black, especially if you're thinking about middle class people. Some of them are peasants, and also how the state has mobilized the category of peasant in a way of weaponizing whiteness. And some others absolutely embrace that category and make the wonderful things that that we have seen with these different communities. But of course, there is a heavy weight to carry when you identify as Black in a racist society. And there's, yeah, that tricky part of how you're recognized by the state, how you're read by the state, and then how you identify yourself. So yes, definitely more work is needed on that. And of course, the ones who need most help are the white mestizo elites in Colombia that, in a way, also part of. And those are the ones who need help, because they haven't been able to understand and come to terms with this.
My name is Isai. I was wondering, how did the Afro-Colombian people end up in the mangroves area in the first place? Like, was it like a decision to go there as a group, or you're like forced to be there in the first place?
Thank you so much for that important question. Maroonage is a big part of that answer. So mangroves were spaces where you could escape the plantation system, or you could escape, a society that was based on the plantation system and the mining as well. So those technologies of slavery that continue to shape reality today. And then people moved to the mangroves, being pushed from the tourist city. So in the mid 20th century, there was a big gentrification movement in Cartagena. That's part of my own history, how my grandma is kicked out of the city that I mentioned. And many of them end up in these areas. And then with the cycle of displacement in the 90s and 2000s, there's a lot of internally displaced people in Colombia because of the war. They end up occupying those spaces that are very precarious and are criminalized as being invaders and encroachers. And then they make life out of that. So it's kind of very interesting to me. Thank you for the question. Do we have questions on Zoom? Okay, good.
Hi. Hi, I'm Margot. I'm a master's student in the International Relations program at UMass Boston. Based on what you were discussing and like what I've seen globally, would you recommend like a more localized approach to climate change rather than like westernized institutions like the UN and whatnot, just going on the ground and kind of like ignoring the localized people? Or would you rather like a purely localized approach, or maybe like a combination of the two?
Oh, Margot, that is a difficult question because I think we need, everything we can. But I agree with you that many of those measures are very problematic and colonial. As Carol mentioned in my introduction, I was part of the IPBES, which is like the sister of the IPCC. So I was able to have some difficult conversations as part of that chapter that we wrote together, talking about, ongoing forms of colonialism, racism. We couldn't say that, so we went for inequalities that are historically reinforced and assumed to be biological or natural. But I think we have to do it. We have to do everything we can, also because the global and the local make each other all the time. And at the same time, yes, we need to occupy those spaces, I think, and then also challenge their logics. Part of my initial work was also about how even conservation is very problematic, how environmental conservation can be very problematic. And then it is also very clear who are the people who are doing things right and who are the ones who should be getting, the credit and the money and everything for stopping climate change that they didn't produce as well. They were not part of the problem, but they are part of the solution. So I think maybe both.
I have a related question that I would really love your thoughts on. I was interested by how you describe mangroves as a new frontier of capital accumulation, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on how mangroves are seen as an eco-solution and what some of the problems with the way that approach could be.
Thank you for that important question. It's part of, I think, those global schemes, global strategies that Margot was mentioning. The whole idea is, yes, we should pay these communities for conserving key marine ecosystems. So coral reefs and mangroves are now very much under, they are now in the spotlight as being, like this solution, these very important ecosystems for carbon sequestration, which is absolutely true. But now the mechanism is just issuing blue bonds, which are debt related. So it's kind of the old replication of these different systems, including REDD+, that we have seen are really problematic because they are done in the name of communities, but they never work for the communities. And I studied in the region some climate mitigation projects, some REDD+ projects that were a complete disaster. They were, again, carried out in the name of the community, but then they caused a lot of displacement, a lot of destruction of forests to actually then have timber plantations. This is the story of Montes de Maria and other parts of my work, and I'm seeing that replicated now with the mangroves. So I think that, yeah, there needs to be another way of involving local communities that is outside of these frontiers of capitalist accumulation, really. Like, it ends up just working for the big companies and big capital in that way. And you can see those landed elites, those criollo, white, mestizo elites that still have power, who are the owners of these hotels, who are behind this harassment to Doña Gloria and other people who live in Villa Gloria. They are already tapping into all of those clean mechanism projects. They now have the certificates that are needed in order to produce legally marijuana and to export it as, as a medicine. And I have no doubt they will be the first ones to also get into the blue economy as part of that. So that's why I feel like, oh, we should be careful. Although I agree, mangroves and coral reefs, we need them. Thank you, Carol. For those of you who didn't hear because you were online or something, Carol's question is about REDD+ and the context of it in Colombia, thinking about the global and local effects. So REDD+ was this project against deforestation, and the idea was like, you can compensate the harm that some companies and countries produce in the global north by planting trees elsewhere. And what we saw is that that became a mechanism of green grabbing, so of land grabbing and resource grabbing. These plantations, which they are, some of them, just big monocrops, big industrial plantations and monocrops of timber, started to take more and more land in places like Colombia. Brazil is another example. A lot of the Amazon forest started to be cut to plant eucalyptus, for example. There are many other different cases. Chile is also a very famous one. And in Colombia, we had one of those mitigation projects in the region that I study in the Caribbean, which is called Montes de Maria. And what happened is that a lot of communities were displaced. And then Ceiba, Melina, and Teca. So I cannot translate the names of all those trees, but teak and other timber trees were planted in the lands of the displaced communities who were forcibly displaced. So again, militarization plays a huge role here. In this area, a lot of massacres led the way into these plantations that were certified by the UN as clean mechanism, that were subsidized by the state because they wanted more of those carbon sinks, and resulted in just more dispossession and more precarious conditions for these communities. So I think that for us, one of the big lessons was, first, climate mitigation is important, but it cannot be done in this way that, again, is benefiting big corporations, and it's at the expense of local communities. But also, a forest is a forest, and a timber monocrop is a timber monocrop. And those discussions, I think, have been taking place in the last 10, 15 years, where REDD+ is now, I think, under more scrutiny, and people are less enthusiastic about it as being a real solution. And I anticipate, these blue economy, blue bonds kind of mechanisms are very similar and go in a similar way. That is not also what I study, the blue bonds. So Catalina Quiroga is someone you want to follow. She's doing her PhD at Lund in Sweden. She has been my co-author in different pieces, and that is her dissertation project. So I hope that she gets to write a lot, and we get to learn more about that. Lily, you will have to wait for the mic. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Shakir. I'm in this class. I had a question. You touched on, and actually you spoke about militarization throughout your presentation, but initially you touched on the U.S. action, the current U.S. action in the region. How do you see that playing out? Do you have any insight? How do you think it's going to affect the communities that you were talking about, the people of the mangroves, the maroons, et cetera?
Yes, thank you for that super important question. And I think that for me, it really connects, again, environmental degradation, climate change effects, and militarization. Like, these bombings are happening at the same time that we have Hurricane Melissa destroying Jamaica and Haiti, other two manufactured disasters and crises. The history of Jamaica is super well portrayed in a movie that is called Life and Death. And Haiti, we can talk for centuries about Haiti, but if you've read The Black Jacobins, you know what I'm talking about, or if you know about the history of it, how those things are very much connected. So it is very evident how these crises, again, are not natural disasters, and how people are being criminalized without even having formal charges or anything. And these are international waters. You're right, many of these communities are also the ones doing a lot of the fast boat trips in the Caribbean. People in San Andres and Providencia, for example, work for the cruise ships, and then they do a lot of itineraries. Some of them take drugs because in a place like Colombia, there's not much left that you can do. There's production of, this no future becomes like, yes, you either work in a cruise ship or you transport some cocaine way north. So a lot of people in the Colombian Caribbean, including Providencia, San Andres, are now in jail in Florida, and are, I guess, the same ones that are being affected by these attacks. So I see all of the connections, both historically, like in the big scheme of things, but also very specifically in how everyday life is shaped by these actions and by these forms of criminalization and anti-Blackness, largely in the region. Yeah. There's one question.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a student in the undergraduate program. I'm in Professor Castro Diaz's class, and you talked a lot about people who are descendants of the diaspora, and they're being displaced into the mangrove forests, and a lot about neocolonialists. And I'm just curious about the people who are indigenous to this island beforehand, before the colonialization, I guess, because I didn't know much about this, the Caribbean, before this talk. So thank you for educating me, and I just want to know a little more about that.
Thank you for that important question. A lot of indigenous peoples were also part of this colonial conquest and the history, of course, of our colonial past and present in Colombia. So populations were decimated, land was taken. A lot of them started to be forced to work in mines and plantations as well. And there was a big debate if, if indigenous people had or not souls, if they can be converted or not to Christianism. That was one of the big debates, and if you've been to Cartagena, there's a big statue of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, this priest who was an advocate that indigenous people had souls. So they were not animals, so they could be converted. That sounds good, but the solution was like, Black people instead, they don't have souls. You can enslave them to free some of the indigenous people. So it's very complicated, but it is a very entangled story. These spaces of maroonage were indigenous and Black. We have some evidence of that in Cartagena, but in Brazil is where I think this scholarship is super well documented. Maroonage spaces included landless, impoverished people, as well as indigenous people, and runaway, runaway sounds really bad, free, liberated, self-liberated Black populations from the slavery system. In my work, a lot of the indigenous peoples and communities that I've been working with are Senu, so they are from a specific region within that region. They don't have a formal recognition in the sense that they don't have a reservation, which would be the equivalent. Resguardos is the figure in Colombia, which is different than reservations, but we can work through that translation. They don't have like a formal title to a given land, specifically in Colombia. So yes, I guess some of these work connects those two realities and how they have also been made separate by multicultural policies that are very restrictive. Like many of the gains of the social movements in the 90s translated into new constitutions for countries like Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, where many rights were granted to indigenous peoples and Black peoples. And this is like granted as if it was a gift from the state. No, it was fought by the social movements. But it was also very restrictive, and it was at the same time that the neoliberal policies were implemented. So it has been complex in that way. But thank you for that very important question, because indigenous peoples are a big part of Colombia, which understands itself as a multicultural nation and pluri-ethnic nation, but then you see how racialized dispossession really shapes access to land, for example, and to resources.
Thank you again. I feel like I'm hogging the questions, but so my question is, all these hotels look absolutely beautiful, but I'm gonna assume that the people that actually do the work are the very people that the hotels are displacing, right?
Exactly.
So, which does not surprise me, unfortunately. But so my question is, in terms of livable wage, how much how much they get paid to basically serve the tourists? Because like I'm old enough to remember when Cartagena was, I mean, in the U.S. in the news, it was like drug capital of the world. Like that's what they portrayed it as. So now it's like I have a friend that's been to Cartagena. Like it's a vacation spot. So, the dichotomy of that is not lost on me. So what I'm wondering is, what is the livable wage of the people that actually do the work that they're displacing? Because I can.
Less than $2 a day.
That's what I.
It's super precarious. You are absolutely right that there is a clear racial line between the tourists who are white mestizo, even international tourists. Most of them are white US tourists and European tourists. And workers, again, cleaners, cooks, hustlers, the people who get you the drugs, the people who connect you with the networks of sex work are Black. And yes, in very precarious conditions. At the same time, these hotels get away with everything they do because they say, we're generating jobs. What else do you want? We're generating jobs. But yes, it is similar. There's other work in Panama, Honduras by Charlene Mollet. She has been analyzing this for other cases. And we have more and more now critical studies of tourism. Before, it was impossible that you criticize tourism because It is the industry without chimneys. It is, fantastic for the community. 20 years ago, criticizing tourism was like very problematic. I was, denied going to conferences, angry people standing up and leaving the room when I mentioned the critiques to tourism. But I think we now have more work on this. We mentioned with Ilinka, we were talking yesterday about the Detour series, which is a series of books on Hawaii, Guam, Japan, Puerto Rico that analyze this. How can we de-touristify spaces as part of a larger decolonial, anti-colonial project?
I believe we have time for one more question.
Okay, great.
No pressure, the last one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe we get time for two and I answer them together. Yeah.
That works.
Hello, my name is Ariana Severside. I'm a student here at UMB. I study environmental science. I'm also in Professor Laura Castro Diaz's class. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. My family's from Trinidad, so I see a lot of parallels in your work. I was just wondering how you go about inciting like empathy and the urgency for change to people that might only care about the financial and economical gains.
Oh, that is a very difficult question. I will try to answer it along yours because we only had time for one. So.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm a part of the undergraduate program at UMass Boston, and I'm also in Laura Castro Diaz's class. And my question was that you said a lot of the hotels are owned by historically powerful families that date back to like the colonialism times when they were given land. And I just wanted to know if you know like how intertwined those families are with like the local government in Cartagena and how much influence that has on the mangrove loss that's happened in the years, because I'm assuming the relationship is deeply correlated.
Thank you so much for that question. That is easier. So I'll go to Jordan's question first. They are members of the political and economic elite to the point that they are the ones designing the adaptation infrastructure for the city that protects, again, the historic center and that also makes more vulnerable these other spaces that are seen as places that you can just simply left to die. I think that Francia Marquez' politics of death, that's why I use it a lot, because it really shows how deliberate it is. And it is not conspiratory, it's because of how power has been sustained for centuries. Thank you for that question. And your question, I think we need to insist that this model is broken, that there's no good capitalism, that green solutions are no solutions. There's a lot of greenwashing, a lot of green militarization also around climate change and environmental issues. And we have to insist that life is more important than profit, and that, this got us here is not going to take us out. Like, it cannot be the solution if it created the problem. We'll leave it there. Yes. Thank you so much. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much for that amazing talk. It was so illuminating. I want to tell all of you that if you want to hear this talk again or tell your friends about it, that the video will be posted on the consortium's website and YouTube channel. I also want to mention that you have information. The next talk in this series is coming up in just 2 weeks. It's called Climate Disruption, Migration, and the Rise of Walls. And it looks at the ways in which the world's wealthiest countries that created the climate crisis are now using militarized borders to try to keep out the many, many people who will be displaced by it. Final reminder, we'd be grateful for your feedback. And thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Diana, for a fantastic talk.